It is that time of the week again when we review all of the ways in which the media cover themselves in glory with our great friend of the show, Katie Halper. She is host of The Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast, now on Substack. Great to see you, Katie.
Good to see you, Katie.
Thanks, you too.
So what do you got for us today?
Oi. I should start with oi. Yeah, a lot of stuff coming out, not surprisingly, tragic stuff happening in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine. And you have the media reliably just egregiously wearing its egregious bias on its sleeve, its pro-Israel bias on its sleeve. In fact, there's a great example of the New York Post, literally.
This is wild, actually.
Yeah, so here we have the New York Post's headline that reads, airstrikes from Hamas militants kill 20 in Israel, including 9 kids. Now, that's a great headline, absolutely great headline, as long as you flip it because it describes Israel, not Hamas, okay? Like these crimes, the killing of 20 people, including 9 kids, was done by Israeli airstrikes.
How did they even get there? Or was it just straight up false?
I mean, no, it's straight up false. This hadn't happened by May 10th. There weren't any numbers on not a single Israeli had been killed yet at this point. And still the numbers are totally disproportionate. And a reminder that, the rockets, Hamas's rockets were fired after, violent attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque and violent enforced evictions. And again, what happens is it's a great formula. The media basically ignores the crimes against humanity that, by the way, Israel is no longer able to hide from its own human rights organizations, which I should point out, B'Tselem, which is Israel's biggest human rights organization, has declared Israel an apartheid state, okay?
Wow.
And Human Rights Watch, which is it's kind of one of the more conservative, lower C conservative human rights organizations based in the United States, they also condemned Israel as an apartheid state. And this is an organization well known for for being a little restrained in its criticism of Israel. So those are two things, by the way, that should be all over the media. I think the media is finally talking about the B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization's condemnation of Israel as an apartheid state. But it came out months ago, and it should have been front page news. I mean, that's a huge, huge deal. Anyway, ignored by the media. And then you have the New York Post. I don't know if it's a subconscious thing, if it's a conscious thing, but this is a perfect metaphor. Of course, as you guys know, with censorship or media bias, it's often, it's implicit. It's not overt. This is one of the times where we actually see it visibly see it. But this type of bias towards Israel, towards the Israeli government, towards the IDF, where the media actually literally often just acts as a stenographer for the IDF.
Well, it is actually really, it's horrific. It's also really interesting to think about how that happened, because clearly the story they wanted was Hamas being the worst actors in all of this. And so this was actually an AP story that they put a headline on. And so whoever reads through that story just literally sees what they want to see in it, even though they get the roles completely reversed. And then when they change the headline, they still keep the focus on Hamas attacks, even though the attack that they highlighted before was actually perpetrated by Israel. The revised headline is Hamas launches new attack on Israel after Jerusalem clashes. So no longer are you putting front and center that kids have been killed, because now you realize, it was the Israelis that did that. So we're still going to focus on the violence just exclusively of Hamas here.
Right. Which is, again, Hamas rockets do not compare to the Israeli military's tools, by the way. First of all, that's one thing, right? And this focus on Hamas is really interesting because, of course, Hamas is not something that we fund, that we arm, and we point to as our special friends, the way we do with the Israeli government. Right. So that's an important point also, right? And again, it's totally disproportionate. And Israel, like the IDF openly uses disproportionate force. That's like a tactic that they fully embrace, which is when they, preemptively or in response come back with a totally disproportionate response. I mean, it's not even like, this isn't this is not a negative criticism. It's just what they actually do. And they admit to doing this. I mean, they don't like to say it to the media, but it's like official policy for the IDF. But yeah, it is incredible. And it's a really good, important point you made, which is that they just had to change the headline. It could no longer be about the killing of civilians and children, because unfortunately for them, It was the Israeli army that did it and not Hamas.
At the same time, Katie, you flagged this, which is that you think that there's been at least a positive uptick in people asking about it. What did you see?
Yeah, by one person. Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see this baby step. So I was surprised to see Matt Lee at the AP.
Mm-hmm. I think we have that actually. Let's take a listen, and then we'll get your reaction.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state.
The Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging.
So
what'd you make of that?
So that's the second half, right? Mm-hmm. And in the first half, you have Ned Price, who's a former CIA guy?
Yes, that's right.
Which is interesting. But basically, he starts out defending self-defense. And is very much talking about the Israeli, use of force, which is hardly defensive at all. And then it's interesting because Matt Lee of the AP asks him, okay, well, do Palestinians have the right to self-defense? He says, I have the text in front of me, but he says he refers to a broader principle of self-defense, says that's something we stand by, which is clearly a reference to what Israel is doing. And then you have this reporter saying, but do you think that that this applies to Palestinians? And he totally, reporters, do you think Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, is that the military response to the rockets coming in is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right? But he won't say that it covers the Palestinians. And again,
what he says it applies to any state, which is a very key word there, right? And I think the reporter calls him out on that too. I see what you're doing there with your word games, and he has essentially no response to that. So it's notable that there was at least some pushback coming from the American press corps, which is something you very rarely see. There were also a couple folks on MSNBC, Ayman Moyaldeen, who has reported from the ground in Gaza, has seen the reality on the ground there. Mehdi Hassan also pressing Israeli officials and former Israeli ambassador in the case of Ayman. Very rare to see that sort of thing on American television.
Yeah, very rare. Again, it's inspiring. I mean, it is a step in the right direction. And as you say, one of the journalists, Saeed, was from Al-Quds, which is not, obviously, it's not the AP. But the fact that the other journalist, Matt Lee, was asking these questions, and he is from the AP, is pretty stunning. He calls out that clearly when you're saying a state has a right to self-defense, you're clearly, because Palestine, kind of relevant part of the story is it does not have a state, you're clearly excluding Palestinians. And by the way, this is a very black and white case under international law. Israel is the occupying power. And it's actually, and in the UN, according to the UN, people who are under an occupying power have the right to self-defense. They're the ones who actually have the right built into international law, while Israel is violating international law. So again, there's this trope. People love saying it's so complicated. You have people chiding other people. You don't really know. You don't live in Israel. There's a lot of complex history. It's like, well, I also don't live in Iraq, and I oppose the war in Iraq, right? So that's a very stupid principle. I wasn't around for the Vietnam War. I still think it was a bad thing. And in this case, again, you have, it's true. There's a lot of complicated diplomatic and political history. Sure. I can't name all the treaties, all the numbers of all the shifting maps, but it doesn't actually matter. There's a very simple principle here and very clear-cut violations of international law, violation of human rights, and that part is black and white. So we can talk about other things. We can even talk about how we got there. That's actually not relevant at all.
Yeah. You can just judge the present moment on its own.
Just judge the present moment.
That's really all we need. It's like I said, you just need to be honest here about what is actually happening. Everybody's standing for their own side, and everyone wants to fake everyone sees some videos and they don't want to look at the other videos, and it's just all bullshit. And it drives me crazy around this entire thing. Anyway, Katie, we got to go. Go ahead.
Okay. A very funny thing is that Israelis and Zionists and American Zionists, Like American Zionists will be like, in 1948, they all wanted to leave. There was no one here, whatever. Israelis, even the ones who are total Zionist hawks, are like, yeah, it was ethnic cleansing. We've done more. We wouldn't have this problem. So
Peter Beinart actually,
you've got a fantastic
Peter Beinart writes about that in the New York Times this morning too, which is another point in favor, at least some tiny sliver of media progress and a little bit more dissent on this issue than we've seen in years past.
A tiny sliver, even tinier than the sliver of land that Palestinians are allowed to have. Just to give you know.
All right,
very
Katie,
well said, Katie. Great to have you. Thank you so much.
Probably bigger. Yeah. You too. Bye.
More Rising for you later today.